She had been invisible for 11 months. Nobody learned her name. Nobody asked of her opinion. They handed her the worst shifts, the dirtiest patients, the work nobody else wanted, and she took it all without a word. Then a man died on that table, and Elena Carter stepped forward when every trained physician in the room stood frozen. One needle, one diagnosis, one decision that none of them had the instincts to make. And the moment she saved him, the room went completely, terrifyingly quiet. Because the woman they had spent almost a year ignoring had just done something none of them could explain. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell because the stories we tell here don't slow down, they don't soften, and they don't end the way you expect. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. We want to see how far this story travels. And if it hit you somewhere real, leave a like. It tells us to keep going. The storm came in low and fast off the Rockies, the kind that turned Denver's streets gray before noon and stripped the last warmth out of a Tuesday that had never had much to begin with. By 7 in the morning, Hartwell Regional Medical Center's emergency department was already running behind. It was always running behind. The charge nurses blamed the staffing ratios, the attendings blamed the charge nurses, and the administrators blamed everyone equally from behind closed office doors on the 4th floor. Elena Carter blamed nobody. She just worked. She had been doing that for 11 months, working quietly, without complaint, in the department's lowest visibility corner. She restocked supply carts before the day shift arrived. She answered call lights that had been ringing for 6 minutes when every other nurse on the floor was somehow busy. She cleaned beds between patients when the techs were overwhelmed, not because it was her job title, but because someone had to do it, and she was already there. In another department, in another hospital, under different management, that kind of work ethic might have earned her something. Here, at Hartwell, it had earned her exactly one thing: invisibility. The ER's charge nurse was a woman named Marlene Briggs. 17 years in emergency medicine, a voice that could cut through a trauma bay in full code, and an absolute certainty bone deep, unexamined, that she understood every person in her department within the first 2 weeks of meeting them. She had clocked Elena Carter in week 1. Mousy, passive, technically competent, but no real instincts. She had filed that assessment away and never revisited it. Carter. Marlene didn't look up from her workstation when she said it. She was scrolling through the overnight census, one hand wrapped around a coffee cup that had long gone cold. Bay 7 needs a full linen change. Patient discharged at 530. Elena was in the middle of hanging a second bag of saline for the patient in Bay for a 61-year-old man with a GI bleed who had been waiting on an endoscopy consult for 2 hours. She checked the drip, adjusted the rate, made a note in her head that his pressure had ticked down 4 points since the last vitals, and said, "I'll get to it in about 10 minutes. I want to get Mr. Aldridge's pressure rechecked first. Bay 7 first." Elena looked at Marlene's profile. The charge nurse still hadn't looked up. "His pressure dropped since last check," Elena said. "He's still waiting on GI. I'd rather Bay 7, Carter." That's not a suggestion. The attending on that side of the department was Dr. Philip Sorrow, mid-40s, brown hair going silver at the temples, the kind of confidence that looked identical to competence until you watched it up close, long enough to see the seams. He had been in the charting room for the past 40 minutes, working through his documentation backlog. He glanced up when Elena walked past, registered her existence the way you register a supply cart, moving through the periphery of your vision, and looked back down. Elena changed the linen in Bay 7. Then she went back to Bay 4 and rechecked Aldridge's pressure herself. It had dropped another 6 points. She flagged it in the chart, paged the GI fellow directly, and kept moving. That was a Tuesday at Hartwell Regional. That was every Tuesday. The other nurses on the floor had sorted themselves into a social architecture that Elena had learned to navigate without ever really entering. There was Priya Mehta, who was sharp and overworked and occasionally kind, and who would have been a genuine ally if she hadn't learned early that befriending Elena cost you something in Marlene's unofficial ledger. There was Dennis Wakefield, a male nurse in his late 20s who worked the trauma bays and who had, in 11 months, said exactly 14 words to Elena counted, not out of bitterness, but because she noticed things. There was Sandra Okafor, who was new enough to still look uncertain, and who sometimes made eye contact with Elena across the room in a way that felt like a question neither of them had the energy to ask out loud. And there was Dr. Sorrow. 3 weeks ago, Elena had been first to a crashing patient in Bay 2, a 44-year-old woman who had come in with what the intake nurse charted as chest discomfort and who had gone into VFib between the waiting room and the bed. Elena had run the code for 90 seconds before Sorrow arrived, had shocked her twice, had the patient back in sinus rhythm by the time he walked through the curtain. He had reviewed the strip, nodded once, taken the chart, and documented it as his resuscitation. At the debrief that afternoon, he had described his clinical decision-making to the residents. Elena had stood against the wall and said nothing. She had told herself it didn't matter. What mattered was the woman was alive. She still believed that. She just also noticed that it had happened. The pileup came in at 11:47 a.m. A Semisi lost its brakes on I-70 westbound and plowed through the tail end of a construction zone backup. The Highway Patrol's first report was 9 vehicles, but by the time EMS started calling into Hartwell, it was 14 cars, a pickup truck, a delivery van, and the weather was making extraction slow. The first ambulance arrived at 11:53. By 12:08, the department had taken in 6 patients, with 4 more inbound. The ER became a different place in those 15 minutes. The low-grade institutional hum phones, monitors, the rolling wheels of IV poles compressed into something tighter and louder. Marlene was on her headset, calling for backup staff. Sorrow was in the trauma bay with a 40-year-old man who'd taken the steering column through his sternum. 2 residents scrambled through the space looking focused in the way medical trainees look focused when they are slightly terrified. Elena moved. She triaged the overflow patients that were being staged in the hallway, getting vitals, checking airways, noting pain scores, flagging 2 of them for immediate attention. She did this without being asked because the 2 nurses who were supposed to be doing it were already pulled into active trauma bays. Marlene walked past her twice without acknowledging it. The 7th patient arrived at 12:19. His name, she would learn later, was Marcus Webb, 26 years old. He had been in the passenger seat of a pickup that was rear-ended at highway speed and then spun into a concrete barrier. The paramedic who brought him in was talking fast GCS of 12, hypotensive at 84/460, pulse ox hanging at 89 on 15 liters, mechanism consistent with chest trauma. The working assumption from EMS was internal bleeding, probably a liver lack or splenic injury. Get him to CT and then to the OR. Bay 3 was the only open trauma space. Elena was already in it, checking the crash cart, when they wheeled Marcus through. He was pale in the way patients go pale when their body is making hard decisions about where decisions ascend blood. His breathing was wrong. Elena noticed it immediately, not the rate, which was fast, but not extraordinary, but the quality. Shallow on the left. Too shallow. His neck veins were visible and distended even flat on the stretcher. And when she looked at his trachea, it was not quite centered. She put her hand on the left side of his chest, barely moving. She looked up at the paramedic. Did he have breath sounds on the left? Diminished, the medic said. We figured, when did that start? En route. Maybe 8 minutes ago. Elena turned to the doorway. I need Dr. Sorrow in Bay 3. The tech at the door, a kid named Jonah, who had been at Hartwell for about 4 months, looked uncertain. He's still with the sternal in Bay 1. I don't know if minus. Page him. Right now. She went back to Marcus. She checked his pulse ox again. 87. His pressure was dropping. She could see it in his color, in the way his hands had gone, dusky. She found the second-year resident, a young man named Doctor Callum Bates, in the hallway and pulled him in. Look at his neck veins. Look at his trachea. Callum looked. Then he looked at her. Tension pneumo, Elena said. We need imaging to... There's no time for imaging. She said it evenly, the way you state a physical fact. His pressure's crashing, his pulse ox is in the 80s, and his trachea is deviating. By the time we get him to CT, he's going to arrest. Callum was 28 years old and 8 months into his residency. He knew what a tension pneumothorax was. He had read about it in 3 textbooks and since seen 2 cases on simulation mannequins during training. He had never decompressed a chest in a real patient. He looked at Marcus Webb and then at Elena Carter and could not in that moment decide which piece of information was more important. Dr. Sorrow appeared in the doorway, gloves half on, still reading Marcus's intake strip. What are we looking at? Tension pneumo, Elena said again. He needs needle decompression now. Sorrow looked at the patient. A beat. A beat, too. The kind of beat that in a different context might look like clinical deliberation, but in this one felt like a man waiting for someone else to be wrong first. Get me imaging, he said. His SAT is 86, Elena said. His trachea is shifted. We'll lose him. Before I said imaging, Carter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That's a clinical decision, not a nursing one. Elena stood very still for 1 second. Then she picked up a 14-gauge angiocath from the crash cart. I need you to do this right now, she said directly to Sorrow. Not pleading, not aggressive. Flat and specific. The way people talk when they are very certain of something and running out of time to explain it. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, left side. If I'm wrong, we've wasted a needle. If you wait and I'm right, he's dead. Something shifted in the room. Callum Bates had taken 2 steps back. The tech was motionless. Marlene, who had appeared silently in the doorway sometime in the last 30 seconds, was watching Sorrow with an unreadable expression. Sorrow took the needle. He placed it at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular, left side. He advanced it. The hiss was audible across the bay, a rush of pressurized air escaping through the needle's hub, sudden and unmistakable. Marcus Webb's pulse ox began climbing before Sorrow had finished stabilizing the catheter. 87, 89, 91. His color changed. The dusky hands pinked. His pressure, when Callum rechecked it 15 seconds later, was 98/62 and climbing. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Sorrow pulled off 1 glove and dropped it in the bin. Get him a chest tube and prep for CT. Make sure thoracic is in the loop. He said this to Callum, not to Elena. He didn't look at her on his way out of the bay. Elena watched the monitors. Marcus Webb's SAT hit 96. His heart rate came down from 138 to 111. She adjusted his O2 setup, noted the time in her head for charting purposes, and checked his pupils equal, reactive, and made a note about needing a repeat neurocheck in 20 minutes. From the doorway, Marlene Briggs was still watching her. Elena did not look back. The department took 2 more patients from the pileup over the next 40 minutes, and then the surge began to settle, not fully, never fully, but into the flattened exhaustion that follows the acute spike when everyone is still moving fast, but the specific terror has passed. Callum Bates found Elena at the medication station at 1:15 p.m. He stood next to her without saying anything for a few seconds. You were right, he said finally. I want you to know that I know that. I know, she said. It wasn't unkind, just accurate. How did you stop? Started again. You had it before we even had a full set of vitals. Before imaging. How did you see that so fast? Elena thought about how to answer that. She thought about the truth, which was complicated, and had a lot of geography in it, and she decided to give him the practical version. I've seen it before, she said. more than once. He waited, clearly hoping she would say more. She didn't. Saro's going to document this as his call, Callum said, quietly, carefully, like he was handing her something he wasn't sure she wanted. I know, she said again. She capped the syringe she'd been preparing and walked back toward the floor. At 2:30 p.m., Marlene called Elena into the small staff office adjacent to the charge station. She closed the door, which was unusual. She stood on the far side of the desk rather than sitting, which Elena noted. I'm going to be direct with you, Marlene said. Please. What happened in Bay 3? Marlene paused. Saro is not happy. You contradicted him in front of a resident and a tech. You essentially forced his hand on a clinical decision. Elena kept her expression neutral. The patient's alive. That's not the point I'm making. What is the point? The point, Marlene's jaw tightened slightly. The point is that this department runs on a clear hierarchy and you stepped outside it. Significantly. And I can't have nursing staff challenging attending physicians in active trauma bays. Even when they're right, Elena. Marlene's voice shifted. Not softer, more careful. I've been doing this for 17 years. I understand what you think you did in there, but you need to understand how it looks. And I need you to understand that Dr. Saro has flagged this with the medical director. Something cool moved through Elena's chest. She recognized it. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the sensation of a situation arriving at the place she had always known. At some level, it was heading. Is there going to be a formal complaint? She asked. There's going to be a review, and I have to be honest with you. Marlene paused again. And Elena noticed the pause was a little too long, the kind that people take when they're deciding how much of what they're about to say they actually believe. I think it would be easier for everyone, including you, if you requested a voluntary reassignment. There's a position opening in long-term care on the 3rd floor. Less acute, less conflict. Elena looked at her. You want me to transfer? I think it would be better. For who? Marlene set her jaw. For the department. The thing about being underestimated for 11 months was that it gave you a very complete picture of the people doing it. Elena had learned Marlene Briggs in granular detail the tells that meant she was uncertain, the specific brand of institutional self-protection that drove her decisions, the way she used the department's hierarchy like a shield when it was convenient and set to decide when it wasn't. She saw all of it clearly in the 4 seconds she spent looking at the woman across the desk. I'll think about it, Elena said. She left the office, walked back to the floor, and began checking on her patients. Aldridge in Bay 4 had finally gotten his GI consult. Sandra Okafor was restocking the linen cart and made brief, uncertain eye contact with Elena as she passed. Callum Bates was writing at a workstation and did not look up, though his shoulders did something when she walked by a small, involuntary acknowledgement, as if his body was more honest than he currently had the courage to. At 3:48 p.m., Doctor. Saro filed a formal complaint with the medical director's office, citing inappropriate scope of practice and undermining attending authority in an active trauma bay. Elena was notified by email while she was documenting her afternoon charting. She read it once, noted the specific language he had used, and saved the notification. She picked up her next chart. At 4:55 p.m., the sound arrived before the explanation did. It started as a vibration, something in the walls, in the floor, in the windows that ran along the eastern face of the ER. Then it became audible, a deep, rhythmic percussion that didn't belong to any piece of hospital equipment. People on the floor looked up at the same time, the way people do when a sound is familiar enough to register, but wrong enough in context to require a second processing pass. Dennis Wakefield, who was walking back from radiology, stopped in the hallway and turned toward the windows. It was unmistakably a helicopter, but not the medical transport helicopters that used Hartwell's rooftop pad. Those were smaller, lighter, with a different acoustic signature. This was something heavier, something with more rotor mass and a lower thrum that you felt in your back molars before you fully heard it. It was coming down in the parking lot, not the pad. The parking lot. Elena moved to the window at the end of the ER corridor, along with 6 other staff members who had the same instinct. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see it a Black Hawk, military configuration. Landing lights cutting through the gray afternoon weather, rotors churning the wet air as it descended between the rows of parked cars with a precision that was clearly deliberate and practiced. 2 vehicles had pulled forward to create clearance, and it took Elena a moment to realize those vehicles were not parking lot bystanders. They were dark SUVs that had already been there, that had made space in advance. Someone had known this was coming. The helicopter touched down. The rotors didn't stop. They cycled down to an idle, the blades still turning, which meant whoever had come here intended to leave again, and soon. Someone call security? Marlene's voice came from behind the cluster of staff at the window. A door opened on the side of the Black Hawk. A man got out tall, in his early 50s, wearing a uniform that was not quite combat, but was not administrative either. He walked through the rain without appearing to notice it, which was the kind of detail Elena's brain flagged automatically. Behind him, 2 people in different clothes, one in civilian dress, one in what looked like some kind of federal insignia. Elena couldn't read from this distance. They came through the ER entrance 40 seconds later. The man in front was not moving like a patient. He was not moving like a family member either. He walked like someone who knew exactly where he was going, which was strange because he had never been in this building before. Elena was certain of that, and yet there was no hesitation in his movement. His eyes moved across the ER floor in a single practiced sweep, the kind of visual assessment that takes in a whole room without landing on any single thing too long, and then they stopped. They stopped on Elena Carter. He walked across the ER floor directly toward her. Not toward the nursing station, not toward Sorrow, who had appeared from the charting room and was now standing near the trauma bay entrance with a look on his face that was trying to be authoritative and not quite getting there. Not toward Marlene, who was already stepping forward with her charge nurse posture assembled, who was standing near Bay 6 with a patient's chart in her hand and rainwater from the windows reflecting gray light across the floor around her feet. He stopped 2 feet away. "Captain Elena Vasquez," he said. The ER floor went quiet in a radius around them. The way sound actually does drop when something important shifts in a room, and every nearby human nervous system registers the change before the conscious mind explains it. Elena looked at him. Something in her went very still. "I go by Carter," she said. "Carter's my married name." "I know," he said. He held something out toward her, not a card, a document folded once. "Major General Thomas Rourke, JSOC. We have a situation that requires your specific expertise. I've been looking for you for 4 weeks." Elena did not take the document immediately. She looked at it, then at him, then briefly, involuntarily, at the faces around her. Marlene's expression had gone through 3 visible phases in the last 10 seconds, and was currently stuck somewhere between confusion and something that looked, from the outside, like the first physical sensation of a mistake made a long time ago and only now arriving at its consequences. Sorrow was very still in the doorway of the charting room. Elena took the document. She unfolded it with both hands, read it for 16 seconds, folded it again. "How critical?" she asked. "Hours," Rourke said. "Possibly less." She handed the chart she'd been holding to Sandra Okafor, who took it with both hands and the expression of someone trying very hard not to react to something she didn't yet understand. Elena reached into her scrub pocket for her badge and keyed it in her palm for a moment-old habit, something she did when she was calculating, and then she looked back at Rourke. "I need 2 minutes to hand off my patients," she said. "You have them." She moved back through the department with the same efficiency she's always moved through it, checking Bay 4, confirming Aldridge's chart, flagging 2 medication timings for the oncoming shift, making a note on the patient in Bay 9 who needed a repeat lactate. She did all of it in 1 minute and 40 seconds. Then she came back. Rourke was exactly where she'd left him. Marlene was now standing 3 feet closer than she had been, in the unmistakable posture of someone who wants to assert authority over a situation that has already moved entirely beyond her reach. "I'm going to need an explanation," Marlene said to Rourke, "about what gives you the right to—" "You'll receive one," Rourke said, not unkindly, and with complete finality. He looked at Elena. Ready? Elena picked up nothing. She had nothing here to pick up. To pick up. 11 months in this department, and she had kept everything that mattered somewhere else. "Yes," she said. They walked toward the exit together, Elena, Rourke, and the 2 people behind him and the ER floor of Hartwell Regional Medical Center watched them go in the specific silence of a room that has just learned something about itself that it cannot quite process yet. Sorrow had not moved from the charting room doorway. His formal complaint was still sitting in the medical director's inbox. Marcus Webb was breathing steadily in Bay 3 with a chest tube and a stable SAT of 98%. And in the parking lot, through the rain and the dying gray afternoon light, the Black Hawk was waiting with its rotors turning. Marlene turned to the room when the doors closed. Every face on the floor was looking at her. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the empty space where Elena Carter had been standing. Outside, the helicopter lifted. The Black Hawk climbed through the gray ceiling of the storm, and Denver disappeared below them, disappeared in pieces the hospital parking lot, the grid of wet streets, the brown and white sprawl of the city, shrinking fast beneath cloud cover until there was nothing out the window but weather. Elena sat across from Rourke, with a headset over her ears, and the document he'd handed her open in her lap, reading it a second time now that she had more than 16 seconds to do it. The helicopter vibrated in the turbulence with a familiar bone-deep rattle she hadn't felt in 4 years. Her hands were steady. She noticed that they were steady and didn't think much about it. Rourke sat with his forearms on his knees, watching her read. He'd been a general long enough that he didn't feel the need to fill silence, which Elena appreciated more than she would have said. She finished the second read and folded the document along its original crease. This says Forward Operating Base Kessler. That's a JSOC black site. It's not listed in any public DoD register. That's correct. I'm a civilian. I've been a civilian for 4 years. You've been working as a civilian, Rourke said, which was a different statement, delivered without any particular emphasis, but with the precision of someone who had thought about the phrasing in advance. Who's the patient? Staff Sergeant Dominic Ferraro. 29. He was extracted from a forward position 6 hours ago with what the on-site medic assessed as blast injury and septic presentation. His team got him to Kessler's surgical bay, and Dr. Harlan Voss performed an exploratory lap, found no significant intra-abdominal injury. Voss closed him. Ferraro's been deteriorating since. How fast? He was responsive at 400. By 700, he was GCS 9. He's at GCS 7 now and falling. Voss says it's septic shock progression and wants to transfer him to Landstuhl. Command says if we move him in his current state, he won't survive the flight. Elena thought about that sequence. What does Voss think I'm here for? Something moved across Rourke's face that was not quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it. Voss doesn't know you're coming. She absorbed that. That's going to be a problem. I'm aware. What's my standing? What authority do I have when I walk in there? You have mine, Rourke said, in writing, which I understand may not make Doctor Voss cooperative, but it will make him legally unable to remove you from the bay. Elena looked out the window. Clouds, turbulence, the occasional lurch and drop that the crew didn't react to. Why me specifically? There are Army flight surgeons. There are trauma specialists with active clearances. Because 2 years ago you wrote a case report on atypical septic presentations following blast injury in closed environments. Specifically, the pattern where standard sepsis markers are suppressed by the body's acute stress response and the patient reads as stable until they catastrophically aren't. He paused. Ferraro fits your profile in 9 of 11 indicators. The 2 Army trauma surgeons we reached first said his presentation was consistent with standard septic progression. Neither of them had read your paper. The helicopter hit a hard pocket of turbulence and dropped 2 feet. The crew adjusted automatically. Elena's hand went flat against the document in her lap by reflex. I wrote that paper under Vasquez, she said. My maiden name. That's how you found me. It took us 4 weeks because you're not in any military personnel database anymore. You're listed as discharged, no forwarding. The hospital HR system at Hartwell had your legal name as Carter. He looked at her steadily. We found you because a trauma fellow in San Antonio remembered a nurse who matched your description giving a conference presentation about blast pattern sepsis 3 years ago. He found the paper. I found you. Elena thought about a 29-year-old man at GCS 7 and falling. She thought about the hours it had taken to find her, the 4 weeks, the Black Hawk in the parking lot of a regional hospital in the middle of a November storm. She thought about the word hours and what Rourke had meant when he said possibly less. Tell me everything Voss found in the OR, she said. Every detail. Phoebe Kessler was not on any map Elena had access to, which meant the flight path was deliberate and opaque. 2 heading changes that she suspected were designed as much to disorient as to avoid civilian airspace. They came down through a break in the cloud cover onto a compound that was smaller than it looked in the brief's single aerial photograph. Prefabricated structures, hardened walls, 2 vehicles outside the main building, a landing pad that the Black Hawk found with the kind of practiced ease that meant it had done this particular landing many times before. They were on the ground for 40 seconds before anyone came out to meet them. The person who did was not military, in bearing mid-30s, lean, with the look of someone who spent a lot of time thinking inside their own head and not much time worrying about whether that was legible to other people. He had a tablet in one hand and stopped 6 feet from Rourke with an expression that said he had been informed of this visit and had opinions about it. General. He didn't extend a hand. Dr. Voss. Rourke's voice was neutral in the way that authority sometimes sounds when it doesn't need to perform. This is Elena Carter. She'll be consulting on Ferraro. Voss looked at Elena the way people look at a thing that has, appeared in a place where it makes no operational sense. His gaze moved from her face to her scrubs, hospital scrub, Hartwell's pale blue, because she had walked off her shift and onto a walked off her shift and military helicopter without changing and then back to her face. She's in scrubs, he said to Rourke. Not to her. She's also standing right here, Elena said. Voss looked at her then. A beat. You're a nurse. Emergency and critical care. And I've worked trauma medicine in theater, which you can verify in the file the general just handed you. She kept her voice even. She had said this kind of sentence before. She knew how to say it in a way that didn't invite argument while also not sounding like it was asking for permission. I'd like to see your patient. Voss didn't move for a moment. He was doing the calculation people do when authority they respect is telling them something that conflicts with their professional assessment of the situation, running the numbers on cooperation versus resistance, measuring his own certainty against the rank of the man standing across from him. Then he turned and walked toward the building. Elena followed. Rourke fell in behind her. The surgical bay at Kessler was better equipped than she'd expected, not hospital grade, in the way a level 1 trauma center was, but real equipment, functional, maintained. Dominic Ferraro was in the single ICU bed, intubated on a vent, with 2 IV lines running and a Foley in place. He was young in the way that 29 looks young, when you see it horizontal and pale under fluorescent light. His vitals were on a monitor mounted to the wall. Elena read them in one sweep, heart rate 128, MAP of 54, temp 38.9, sat 94% on 60% FiO2. A MAP of 54 was below the threshold for adequate organ perfusion. He was on 2 pressors, She could see both drips running. His urine output, according to the Foley bag, was minimal. She went to his bedside and did something that surprised Voss enough that he took a half step forward. She put both hands on the patient. Not on the chart, not on the monitor, on Ferraro. She palpated his abdomen, checking for rigidity in the areas outside the surgical site. She pressed along his flank. She checked his skin turgor, his capillary refill, the modeling pattern on his legs. His wound cultures? She asked. Pending, sent at 600. What did his abdomen look like when you went in? Consistent with blast injury. Some peritoneal contamination, minimal, irrigated and closed. No significant bowel involvement. Did you check the retroperitoneal space? A pause. The indication for exploration was intra-abdominal injury. The retroperitoneum was directly adjacent to the blast vector, based on the mechanism you described. She wasn't accusatory. She was specific, which was different. A retroperitoneal hematoma can expand slowly enough post-injury that it looks stable for hours. If it's infected, the initial blast introduced contamination that the irrigation didn't reach, you'd see exactly this presentation. Standard sepsis markers suppressed by the acute response, MAP declining despite 2 pressors, and a source that wasn't visible in the primary exploration. Voss was quiet. I'm not saying that's what it is, Elena said. I'm saying that's what it looks like, and I need your imaging. He handed her the tablet with the CT that had been done pre-op. She scrolled through it, slice by slice, slowly starting at the top. The images were 8 hours old. Voss stood at her shoulder, and she could feel the specific tension of a physician watching someone else review their work, the professional vulnerability of it. The way it required a particular kind of discipline not to explain every slide preemptively. She found it at the L3 level. A density behind the left psoas muscle, irregular border, slightly higher attenuation than the surrounding tissue. Easy to miss. The kind of thing that if you went into the abdomen expecting peritoneal injury and found relatively little, you might not look for on a pre-op scan you were reviewing quickly under field conditions. Here, she said, and held the tablet up for him. Voss looked. His jaw moved once. That could be artifact, he said. It could be. She set the tablet down. Or it's an infected retroperitoneal hematoma, and he needs to go back to the OR. Re-exploring him in his current hemodynamic state is dangerous, Elena said. I know. Not re-exploring him, if I'm right, is fatal. She looked at Ferraro. Somewhere inside the machinery of the vent and the drips and the monitors, the 29-year-old parts of him no longer visible in the clinical picture. What's his lactate? 8.2. Last check. A lactate of 8.2 was not compatible with someone who had more than a few hours before his organs began sequentially failing. Elena did the arithmetic in her head. She looked at the pressor drips. She checked the vent settings. He needs an exploratory laparotomy, she said. Retroperitoneal focus, and he needs it in the next 2 hours. I'm not taking him back to the OR based on a density on a pre-op scan interpreted by A. Voss stopped himself. By a nurse, Elena said. You can say it. I've heard it today already. She pulled a chair from beside the bed and sat down not because she was tired, but because standing, while saying this, felt like the wrong register. Like she was trying to win an argument instead of save a patient. She looked up at Voss from the chair. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to look at the evidence. Lactate 8.2, MAP 54 on 2 pressors. Temperature trending up despite antibiotics. No other identifiable source. And a density on imaging at the exact anatomical location that corresponds to his blast vector. She paused. What else does he have to show you before you go back in? Voss looked at Ferraro. A long look, the kind that surgeons do when they're not performing a deliberation, but actually doing it, running the case through every relevant framework, looking for the angle they missed. He looked at Rourke, who had been standing near the door this entire time, saying nothing. Rourke said nothing now, either. He was very good at that. Voss looked back at Elena. If you're wrong, he said, the stress of re-exploration in his current state could kill him. Yes, she said, I know. Another silence. The vent cycled. Ferraro's monitor emitted its quiet, rhythmic testimony. I'll need to call this in to the surgical chain, Voss said. How long will that take? He was already moving toward the phone on the wall. 30 minutes, maybe less. Make it less, Elena said. While Voss made his calls, Elena stayed at Ferraro's bedside and did what she always did in situations where the next critical action was someone else's decision. She worked the margins. She rechecked his medication drips. She noted that his norepinephrine rate was near the ceiling, and his vasopressin hadn't been adjusted in 4 hours. She flagged that for Voss's corpsman, steady-handed specialist named Britta Callahan, who had been managing the ICU bay, and who, unlike her physician, did not seem to have any particular problem with Elena's presence. Callahan moved efficiently, asked clear questions, implemented the suggestions without ceremony. How long has he been like this? Elena asked her quietly. Since about 500. He was talking at midnight, complaining about the food. Callahan kept her hands moving, adjusting the line, checking the site. His team's been outside since 600. They know it's bad. His team is here? 4 of them. They flew in with him. Command told them to stay in the common area. She paused. They're not exactly staying in the common area. Elena glanced toward the door. Through its small reinforced window, she could see a hallway, and at the end of the hallway, visible from this angle in the form of boots and the lower portions of combat gear, a cluster of people who were not moving away. She turned back to Ferraro. She watched his chest rise and fall with the vent's rhythm, not his rhythm. The machines, and she thought about the paper she had written in a base hospital in a country that was hot and flat and nothing like Colorado. 3 years before she filed her discharge paperwork and drove to Denver and applied for a nursing job at a regional hospital because the pay was reasonable and the location was far enough from everything she'd been doing that she thought maybe the distance would feel like something. It had felt like something, just not the thing she'd been looking for. Voss came back in 22 minutes. His expression was different, not softer, but resolved in a way it hadn't been before. Surgical chain approved re-exploration. I want a fresh CT first, if we can stabilize him enough to move. You have time for one cut? Elena asked. What? If we can get his map above 60 long enough for a quick scan, 20 minutes, do it. If we can't move his map, we skip the scan and go directly. She looked at Callahan. What happens if we push his norepinephrine? Rate up 5 mics right now. Heart rate's already 128, Callahan said. Could tip into arrhythmia. What's his potassium? Callahan checked the most recent labs. 3.1. Okay, we replicate first. She looked at Voss. I know that's your call, I'm asking. Voss stood at the foot of the bed. He was looking at Ferraro with the expression of a man who had just been handed back a case he thought he'd closed and was now seeing it from an angle he hadn't stood at before. It was not comfortable. Elena didn't imagine it was supposed to be. Replicate and reassess in 30 minutes, he said. If his map clears 60, we scan. If it doesn't, we go straight in. He looked at Elena. I want you in the OR. She didn't let her expression change. All right. Not because I'm conceding your interpretation, he said, which was the kind of thing a person says when they need the record to show they didn't blink, even when they did. Because you've identified specific anatomical focus points, and I want them on record as the operative target in case. He stopped. In case something happens to me mid-procedure and someone else needs to take over. It was a clinical rationale. It was also something else, something she recognized the specific way. A good doctor, even a defensive one, makes the right call when the patient is running out of time for anything else. Understood, she said. They stabilized Ferraro's MAPI to 61 over the following 25 minutes barely, and with Callahan pushing IV fluids at a rate that was aggressive enough to make Voss visibly uncomfortable. The scan took 18 minutes. Elena rode with them to the imaging room and stood outside the scanner, watching through the window. And when the technician pulled the images, she was looking at them before Voss was fully in the room. The retroperitoneal density was larger than it had been in the pre-op scan. It had a gas locule in it now, a small dark bubble on imaging that meant bacterial activity. That meant infection. That meant she had been right, and they were now slightly more behind the clock than they had been when she first walked in. She didn't say, "I told you." She pointed at the locule and said, "There's your source," and moved toward the OR. The operation took 2 hours and 11 minutes. Voss was the surgeon. Elena was not scrubbed in, but stood at the periphery in the role that had been outlined, observing, available, logging the anatomical findings against the imaging targets she had identified. The retroperitoneal hematoma was exactly where the CT had shown it. It was infected with the specific polymicrobial pattern she had described in her paper, the kind of contamination that gets introduced by blast debris, and then sealed off from standard drainage by the hematoma's own clotted structure, invisible to the primary exploration, progressing silently while the patient's acute stress response keeps the classic sepsis markers suppressed. When Voss drained and irrigated it and closed, Ferraro's map began to rise within the first 30 minutes of the post-operative period, from 58 to 64, from 64 to 71. His lactate, rechecked at the 2-hour mark, was 5.6. Still high, but moving in the direction of a human being who might survive this. Callahan found Elena in the hallway outside the surgical bay, back in her original spot near the window. "His team is asking about him," she said. "Tell them his pressure's improving. They want to know who called it." Elena looked out the window. The storm had broken while they were in the OR, the clouds pulling apart, and the last of the afternoon light was doing something specific and temporary across the compound's flat expanse, the kind of light that happens at the end of bad weather and lasts about 6 minutes before the dark comes properly. "Tell them his surgeon made the right call," she said. Callahan looked at her for a moment. "That's not what happened. It's what's useful," Elena said. Rourke found her an hour later in the common area, where she was sitting at a metal table with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm and the kind of exhaustion that lives specifically in the space between a crisis and its resolution. Not the bone tiredness of sustained physical effort, but the specific drain of being the person who had to be right when everyone around her was betting against it. He sat across from her. He didn't have coffee. He had the look of a man who had been managing several problems simultaneously and had just watched one of them resolve. "Ferraro's map is 74, he said. "Voss thinks he'll make it." "Probably," Elena said. "He needs at least a week of IV antibiotics and close monitoring. But the source is gone. His body can do the rest." Rourke nodded. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "I want to talk to you about something. The job offer that's coming." "Yes." He stopped. "You knew. You didn't send a Black Hawk to a hospital parking lot to say thank you," she said. "What is it?" "There's a unit we're building," he said. "Medical advisory, embedded with JSOC forward elements. The specific skill set we need is it's not a standard profile. We need people who can function in austere environments, who have trauma experience, who understand both the clinical and the tactical picture, who can work in situations where the physician in the room is wrong and knows how to handle that without destroying the operational structure." He paused. "You did that today with Voss. You were right. You pushed it without going around him. And by the end, he was the one who called the OR. He needed to own it," Elena said. "Otherwise, he wouldn't have been fully in." "Exactly." Rourke looked at her steadily. "That's not a skill you can train in 12 weeks. Elena turned the coffee cup once in her hands. She thought about Hartwell Regional. She thought about Marlene Briggs's office and the careful phrasing about voluntary reassignment. She thought about Saro's formal complaint sitting in someone's inbox, about Callum Bates's apology in the corridor, about 11 months of invisible work in a department that had looked at her. and seen an orderly with a nursing license. She thought about the part of herself she had tried to file away when she left the military. The part that was very good at exactly the kind of thing that had happened today. The part she had spent 4 years being careful not to need. "I'll need to know the full scope before I decide anything," she said. "Of course. And there are things that happened at Hartwell today that aren't finished. The complaint that Sorrow filed. The review Marlene was threatening. I'm not walking away from that." Rourke looked at her with something she couldn't immediately categorize, not surprise. Exactly, but a recalibration. The expression of a man adjusting his estimate of a situation upward. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I didn't spend 11 months in that department getting treated like furniture so I could disappear on a helicopter and let Sorrow's formal complaint stand on the record." Her voice was quiet. Specific. "I want to know what this offer gives me in terms of standing." "Formal standing, because the next conversation I have with Hartwell Regional's medical director, I want to have it from somewhere other than the bottom of the room." Rourke was quiet for a moment. Outside, the last of the good light was going. The compound was settling into evening in the way military installations settle, not dark exactly, but purposeful. Every space lit to the degree it needed to be, and not more. "Your discharge papers," he said slowly, "can be reclassified. Your service record, the parts that were sealed when you left can be unsealed if you re-enter under the new unit structure." "Unsealed how?" "Enough that when someone runs your credentials," he said, "what comes back is not discharged nurse. No forwarding. What comes back is," he looked at her, "considerably more than that." Elena set down the coffee cup. She was about to say something. She had the shape of it in her mouth when the door to the common area opened and a man came through it who was not Callahan and was not one of Rourke's staff. He was in his late 20s, built like someone who carries heavy things for extended distances, and he had the particular face of a person who has been awake for 36 hours managing an emotion he can't fully afford to let out. He stopped 2 feet inside the door and looked directly at Elena. "You're the one who figured it out," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Dom's going to recover," she said. "That's what matters." "No." His voice cracked slightly on the word, "not weakness. Just a structural thing, the way a voice does when it's been holding something at arm's length for a long time, and the holding finally cost something. No, I've been in this room for 6 hours watching them tell me he was declining and there was nothing to do, and the best option was to move him and hope he survived the flight. You walked in here and..." He stopped, swallowed. "I need to know who you are." Elena looked at him. He had the rank insignia of a sergeant first class and the eyes of someone who takes the safety of his people personally enough that when it goes wrong, it goes into a part of him that doesn't have easy access to language. "Carter," she said, "I'm just a nurse." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Rourke, and something passed between them that Elena didn't try to read. "Right," the sergeant said. He turned and walked back out. But he stopped in the doorway, just for a second without turning around. "Thank you," he said to the room, or to her, or to whatever part of the air she occupied. The door closed. Rourke picked up the document he'd brought to the meeting and set it flat on the table between them. Elena looked at it. It was different from the first one, longer, more sections. A cover page with the kind of classification markings that you didn't see on administrative paperwork. "Read it tonight," he said. "I need an answer by 600. She pulled the document toward her. Outside, somewhere in the compound, a door opened and closed, and the voices of Ferraro's team carried briefly through the thin walls before the wind took them low. Male voices, doing the specific thing that soldiers' voices do when something that was very bad has turned in a direction that might, against the arithmetic of the day, be survivable. Elena opened the first page of the document. At the bottom of page 3, under a heading that she had not expected to find in any paperwork connected to a consulting offer, was a name she recognized. Names attached to an incident from 5 years ago in a forward operating environment that had ended her military career and started the chain of events that had brought her, eventually, to a hospital in Denver where people called her an orderly with a nursing license. She read the paragraph 3 times. Then she looked up at Rourke. "You knew about this when you came to find me," she said. His expression didn't change, but he didn't say no. The name on page 3 was Colonel Richard Harwick. Sanitz, curiously. Elena sat with that for a moment, the way you sit with something that you've been carrying at the back of your mind for so long that seeing it written down in official print feels less like a revelation and more like a door. Finally, opening into a room you already knew was there. The document's language around it was careful, bureaucratic, passive-voiced, the specific grammar of official accountability that acknowledges without admitting, but the substance was not ambiguous. Harwick's name appeared in the context of an internal DoD review. The review concerned a forward medical station in a classified operational theater 5 years ago and a set of clinical decisions made under his authority that had resulted in 3 preventable deaths and the forced discharge of a medical officer who had formally objected to those decisions in writing. The medical officer's name in the document was Captain Elena Vasquez. She looked up at Rourke. He was watching her, with the patience of someone who had already decided what he was going to say and was waiting for her to finish processing before he said it. "You knew about this when you came to find me," she said. His expression didn't change, but he didn't say no. "How long has Harwick been under review?" she asked. "Formally, 8 months. The investigation opened after a second incident, different theater, different personnel, same pattern. A surgical decision that shouldn't have been made, a subordinate who objected and was silenced." He paused. "The investigator found your discharge file, your formal objection. The review board decided your testimony was material." "My testimony," she said. The word sat in her mouth at a specific angle. "Is that what the job offer is? You need me to testify, and the assignment is the mechanism to get me back inside the legal structure where my statement carries weight." "No." He said it without hesitation. "The unit is real. The assignment is real. Ferraro was real. What happened today was not a setup." He looked at her steadily. "But you asked me to be direct, so I'm being direct. Yes, your testimony about Harwick is part of what's at stake. And yes, if you come back in under this assignment, your standing changes in ways that make that testimony significantly harder to bury." "Who's been trying to bury it?" "Harwick has friends. Senior ones." Rourke's voice was flat. "He's been a colonel for 9 years. He knows where things are kept." Elena looked back at the document, at Harwick's name. She thought about the 3 men who had died at that forward station, not in combat, not from wounds that couldn't have been treated, but from decisions made by a physician who was protecting an operational timeline over 3 human lives, and who had looked at a 30-year-old Army captain who filed a formal objection and decided that the objection was the problem, not the deaths. She thought about the discharge papers, the drive to Denver, the job at Hartwell, the bad shifts, the invisible work, Marlene Briggs's office, voluntary reassignment. She thought about all the distance she had put between herself and this specific room, and how little of it had actually been distance. "I need to sleep," she said, "and I need to read the rest of this. There's a bunk in the East Wing. Callahan can show you." Rourke stood. 600, Carter. "I heard you the first time," she said. She read the document twice more before she slept, and once more when she woke at 445. Sitting on the edge of the bunk, in the specific gray pre-dawn of a military installation, the kind of light that never quite got dark and never quite got bright. By the time she walked into the briefing room at 552, she had made her decision. She had made her decision, but she didn't lead with it. She sat down across from Rourke and the JAG officer he had brought in overnight, a woman named Major Prentice, compact, efficient, with the kind of legal mind that organized itself visibly behind her eyes, and she asked the questions she needed, answered first. It took 40 minutes. At the end of them, she signed where Prentice indicated. The paperwork that came back to her was not a nursing contract. It had different language, different precedents, and at the top, under the DoD seal, a rank designation she had not held in 4 years. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it in the inside pocket of the jacket. Callahan had found her military issue, olive drab, because her scrubs were not going to be adequate for whatever came next. "One thing before we move to the Harwick matter," she said to Rourke. "Hartwell Regional," he said. "Sorrow's complaint. The review. I want it addressed. Formally." Rourke looked at Prentice, who was already pulling something up on her laptop. "The medical director at Hartwell is a man named Dr. Lawrence Osee," Prentice said. "He received Sorrow's complaint yesterday at 1,600. He has not yet acted on it. The complaint alleges inappropriate scope of practice during an active trauma response." She looked up. "Given that the patient survived specifically because of the nursing intervention in question, and given your current reentry documentation," tapped the file she'd prepared, "I'd say, Dr. Osee is going to have a difficult time finding grounds to proceed." "I don't want it quietly dropped," Elena said. "I want a formal finding." Prentice looked at her. "That triggers a full review of the incident." "Good. It also puts Sorrow's documentation under scrutiny." "Better," Elena said. Rourke studied her. There was something in his expression that was not quite admiration, but was adjacent to it, the specific look of a person recalibrating an estimate for the sec time in 2 days. "You've been thinking about this since yesterday afternoon," he said. "Since Marlene's office," Elena said. "I want the review, and I want it on record that I requested it." The Harwick briefing started at 700 and ran for 3 hours. Colonel Richard Harwick was currently stationed at a logistics command base in Virginia, a comfortable posting, administrative, the kind of lateral move that looked like career management and functioned as protective distance. The DoD review against him had stalled twice in 8 months, both times at the evidentiary stage, both times because witnesses who had initially agreed to provide statements had subsequently withdrawn. The pattern was consistent enough that the investigative team had flagged it, but couldn't prove coordination. Elena's case was different from the others because she had done something 5 years ago that none of the other objectors had done. Before she was discharged, in the 48 hours between filing her formal objection and receiving the discharge orders, she had made copies. Not of classified operational material, she had been precise about that, careful in the way that someone is careful when they expect to need the records later and want them to hold. Medical charts, clinical logs. Her own contemporaneous notes on the 3 cases, written in real time, dated, countersigned, where she'd been able to get a second signature. She had sent them through a channel that was legal and obscure enough that they hadn't been found, to a secure location she had accessed exactly once in 4 years. When she told Rourke this, the room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when information changes the shape of a problem. "You've had the documentation for 5 years, Prentice said. "Yes. And you didn't." She stopped. Started again. "Why didn't you submit it through the formal complaint process at the time?" "Because at the time I was being discharged under a process that Harwick controlled the paperwork for. Anything I submitted formally would have gone through his chain." Elena kept her voice even. "I needed it somewhere he couldn't reach it. And now?" "Now I'm somewhere he can't reach it either," she said. So, the secure retrieval took 2 hours and required Prentice to coordinate with a records facility that Elena had not spoken to in 4 years, and that responded to the authorization code she provided from memory. Because she had made herself memorize it the same week, she copied the documents with a confirmation that took 11 minutes and involved two identity verification steps that Prentice watched with an expression of focused professional attention. The files came through encrypted. Elena decrypted them. She laid them on the briefing table in a sequence that told a story, and she walked Prentice through them the way she had walked us through Ferraro's imaging, methodically, without drama, letting the evidence do the work. Clinical chart, patient 1, the initial presentation, her assessment, her documented recommendation, Harwick's countermanding order, the patient's subsequent deterioration, the outcome. Clinical chart patient 2, the same pattern, different injury, same override, same outcome. Clinical chart patient 3, the same, with the addition of her written objection, filed 22 hours before the patient died, and Harwick's written response 2 sentences, dismissive, official filed 16 hours before the same. Her formal objection, full text. The discharge orders dated 17 hours after the 3rd patient's death. Prentice read through all of it without speaking. When she finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, not dramatically, just the involuntary physical expression of a legal mind reorienting around new information. "This is sufficient," she said. "This is more than sufficient. The stalled reviews with this material, the evidentiary gaps close. The witness withdrawals become secondary. There's something else," Elena said. She slid the last page across the table. It was a single sheet, her own handwriting, not typed, dated 5 years ago, the night before she received the discharge orders. A list of names, 7 of them. People who had been present at the forward station during the 3 incidents, all of whom had knowledge of what had happened, and all of whom had, as far as she knew, been absorbed back into various postings, without anyone connecting them to this specific pattern. 3 of those people are still on active duty, she said. I don't know their current postings, but if the review board can find them before Harwick's Networks does. I can find them, Tess said, and her voice had the quality of someone who has just been handed a case that they intend to complete. By midday, Elena had been at FOB Kessler for just under 24 hours, and Dominic Ferraro's ESMAP was holding at 79 on reduced pressors. She checked on him before she did. Anything else went to the ICU. Bay read the overnight chart, noted that his lactate had come down to 2.8, and his urine output had improved. Callahan was at the monitoring station. She looked up when Elena came in and gave a brief nod that communicated several things simultaneously. Voss was in the bay doing morning rounds. He didn't look up immediately when Elena entered, and she read the deliberateness of it. He was a precise man, and his inattention was not careless. She went to Ferraro's chart and reviewed the overnight notes without speaking. His antibiotic coverage needs adjustment, she said. The culture results came back. She pointed to the entry in the chart. He's got a gram-negative component that the current regimen isn't covering optimally. I'd add piperacillin tazobactam and reassess in 12 hours. Voss looked at the culture results. He looked at the current medication list. He stood with that for a moment. I was going to make that adjustment at afternoon rounds, he said. She was not sure that was true. She was not sure he was sure it was true. What she was sure of was that saying so would serve nothing, so she didn't. Good, she said. It'll help. She set the chart back on the hook and turned to leave. Voss said her name Carter, and she stopped. What you identified yesterday, he said. He was looking at the chart, not at her. The retroperitoneal density. I've been thinking about the imaging review. In field conditions, with the mechanism we presented, I don't think another surgeon would have caught it either. Probably not, she said. I want to understand how you did. He looked at her then. Not to defend the miss. I want to understand your reasoning process. Elena stood in the doorway and looked at Harlan Voss, 40-something, technically excellent, genuinely good at what he did, and carrying the specific discomfort of a man who has had to revise his understanding of a situation without yet having revised his understanding of the person who revised it for him. He was not asking her to absolve him. He was asking her to teach him something. Those were different requests, and the second one deserved an honest answer. Blast injury in a closed environment suppresses the normal inflammatory response, she said. The acute stress load essentially competes with the septic cascade for the same physiological pathways. So the standard markers fever, elevated white count, classic sepsis presentation get blunted. What you see instead is a patient who looks stabler than they are, trending in a direction that looks like normal post-op course until the competing mechanism resolves and the infection takes over the field. She paused. The tell is the lactate. Lactate doesn't get suppressed the same way. If the lactate is moving in the wrong direction, and the clinical picture says the patient is stable, the clinical picture is lying. Voss was quiet for a moment. That's in your paper. That's in my paper, she agreed. He nodded once. Not agreement, exactly. Absorption. I'd like to read the full version, he said. Not the summary I was given. I'll get you a copy, she said, and left. The call to Hartwell Regional's psychoanalyst medical director happened at 1400 on a secure line in the briefing room, with Prentice present and recording. Dr. Lawrence Osi picked up on the second ring and spent the first 30 seconds of the conversation managing his own surprise, which he did professionally, but not seamlessly. He was a careful man. Elena could hear that the kind of administrator who thought about consequences before he spoke, which in this context meant he was already calculating before Prentice had finished introducing the legal basis for the call. Elena did not speak for the first 10 minutes. She let Prentice establish the framework, the re-entry documentation, the jurisdictional standing, the formal record of the previous day's clinical event at Hartwell and its outcome. She listened to Osi's responses and noted the places where he was careful and the places where he wasn't. When Prentice indicated, Elena spoke. Dr. Osi, I want to be clear about what I'm requesting. I'm not asking for Dr. Sorrow's complaint to be dismissed. I'm asking for a formal clinical review of the incident in Bay 3 on November 11th, conducted according to Hartwell's standard peer review protocol. I want the review to assess whether the nursing intervention was clinically appropriate and whether the attending physician's initial response was appropriate. I want the findings documented. A pause is on the line. Captain Carter, he stopped himself, adjusted. Osi was smart enough to have looked at the rank designation in the documentation. Prentice had sent ahead of the call the standard protocol for peer review in a situation like this. It takes 4 to 6 weeks, Elena said. I know. I'm not asking for it faster. I'm asking for it at all. And I'm asking that Dr. Sorrow's complaint remain in its filed state, neither acted upon nor withdrawn until the peer review concludes. That's an unusual request. The situation was unusual, she said. A patient survived because of a nursing assessment that the attending physician initially refused to act on. I think the record should reflect the clinical facts. Another pause, longer. She could hear Osi's specific silence, the silence of a man who had just received Sorrow's complaint the previous afternoon and had not yet committed to it, who was now doing the arithmetic on what committing to it would look like in 6 weeks when the peer review came back, and what the documentation of a general's and consulting involvement in the previous day's events would look like sitting next to a complaint about the same nurse. I'll initiate the peer review this afternoon, Osi said. Thank you, Elena said. And Nurse Foster's involvement, Prentice said, using Marlene's professional title with a precision that was not accidental. The voluntary reassignment suggestion. I'll need to review that conversation in the context of, that would be appropriate, Prentice said pleasantly, and ended the call. Elena sat with the phone on the table for a moment. Outside the briefing room's single window, the compound was doing its midday thing, personnel moving with purpose between structures, a vehicle pulling through the gate, the flat winter sky pressing down on everything with the impartiality that sky has. She thought about Marlene's office, the closed door. The specific phrasing, it would be easier for everyone, including you. She thought about 11 months of invisible work and what it was worth, and whether worth was even the right word for what she was trying to reclaim. Not worth, she decided. Record. She was trying to get the record right. At 1530, Rourke called her into his office, a small room sparse, with a field-grade functionality that suited him. He had a laptop open and a document on the screen that she recognized from the briefing as part of the Harwick investigation file. He turned the laptop to face her when she sat down. We've located 2 of the 7 names on your list, he said. Both active duty. One is at Fort Bragg. She's a senior medic, Master to Sergeant Delgado. The other is a warrant officer in Germany, CW 3 Marks. Prentice has contacted both through secure channels. He paused. Delgado wants to speak to you directly, before she agrees to anything. When? Tonight, if you're available. Secure video. I'm available. He nodded and closed the laptop. He did not immediately say whatever he had called her in to say, which meant there was something else. Elena waited. There's a development with Harwick, he said. She stayed still. He was informed this morning that the review was reopening. We don't know how there are 3 possible channels, and Prentice is looking at all of them. But he filed through his JAGI, a preemptive counterclaim this afternoon. He's alleging that the original documentation from your formal objection was improperly retained. Rourke's voice was careful. He's arguing that the copies you made should be inadmissible because you removed them from a classified operational environment. Elena looked at him. I removed clinical charts, not operational documents. Classification status of those charts. He's arguing they were operationally sensitive by the nature of the theater they were generated in. She stopped, took one even breath. That's a stretch. Yes, Rourke said, it is. Prentice says it's a delay tactic, not a viable legal argument. But delay is what he needs. He looked at her. We have a timeline. The review board's evidentiary window closes in 19 days. If Harwick can keep the documentation challenge alive for 3 weeks, the window closes and it resets another 6 months minimum before it can reopen. 19 days. Elena looked at the wall and ran the arithmetic. Prentice had found 2 witnesses. There were 5 more names on the list, and the witnesses were the corroborating layer without them. The documentation was strong but singular, a single officer's records against a colonel's counter-narrative. Harwick knew that. He had spent 5 years knowing that. How many of the 7 does Prentice need to break the counterclaim? She asked. She says 3 minimum. 2 to corroborate the clinical events, 1 to corroborate the discharge process. He paused. Delgado was there for 2 of the 3 incidents. If she speaks, and Marks backs her, you have 2. You need 1 more. The others on the list, 2 are unlocatable so far. 2 have changed postings in the last year, and the transfer records are taking time to clear. He looked at her directly. One of them, Corporal Nadia Reston. She was a pharmacy tech at the station. Her last posting was a base hospital in New Mexico. But she's not on active duty anymore. She separated 2 years ago. She's civilian. Yes, no legal mechanism to compel her. We'd have to find her, and she'd have to agree voluntarily. He let that sit for a moment. And there's the question of whether Harwick's people find her first. The room was very quiet. Elena could hear the compound outside a door somewhere, the distant sound of a vehicle. She thought about a pharmacy tech who had been 20-something at a forward station 5 years ago, who had seen what Elena had seen, who had then gone home and separated and become a civilian in New Mexico, who had, in all probability, spent the intervening years trying to put as much distance between herself and that operational theater as Elena had tried to put between herself and the army. She thought about how much good the distance had done, either of them. I need everything you have on Reston's last known location, she said. Rourke's expression shifted. Carter, this isn't your job to... It's exactly my job, she said. You told me the unit's mission is to function in situations where the standard channels aren't enough. Finding a civilian witness before a colonel's legal team does that fits. You've been back in this structure for approximately 14 hours. 15, she said, and I'm clear on what I assigned. What do you have on Reston? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and slid a thin folder across the desk. Last known's Albuquerque. She was working in a civilian pharmacy, independent. The address is 8 months old. Elena took the folder. She opened it. The photograph of Nadia Reston showed a young woman in her late 20s, dark-haired, small-framed, the specific expression of someone who is positioned in front of a camera for official purposes. and would prefer not to be. Nothing in the photograph told Elena anything about what she might look like after 2 years as a civilian in a desert city, or what she might say when someone knocked on her door and asked her to go back to the worst thing she'd ever witnessed in a professional capacity. "I need transport to Albuquerque," Elena said. "I can get you there by tonight," Rourke said. He did not look happy about it, which Elena noted. He was a general who was accustomed to operations proceeding along defined channels, and she had been inside his structure for 15 hours and was already moving laterally. But he also was not stopping her, which told her that he understood at some level that the defined channels were exactly what Harwick had spent 5 years learning to block. "One more thing," she said. He waited. "Voss," she said. "He's good. And he's starting to understand what he doesn't know, which is when surgeons are actually dangerous in the good way." She looked at Rourke. He'd be an asset to the unit. Rourke looked at her. "You've been here 15 hours. "I know what I'm looking at," she said. "You did." He held her gaze for a moment. Then, very slightly, he nodded. The transport south was a smaller aircraft, a military liaison plane, 4 seats, efficient and cold. Elena slept for 40 minutes of the 90-minute flight, which was not enough and was still more than she'd been getting at Hartwell on a regular basis. She reviewed the rest-on file again during the remaining 50 minutes, committing the details to the part of her memory that retained operational information, addresses, timelines, the name of the pharmacy on Manal Boulevard, where Reston had worked 8 months ago. She landed at Kirtland Air Force Base at 2040. A vehicle was waiting civilian-looking, a dark sedan with a base sticker and a driver who was in civilian clothes and did not volunteer his name. She did not ask for it. He drove her to the edge of the base and handed her a phone and a set of keys to a rental car parked at a gas station on the corner. She transferred into it, noted the full tank, and drove north into the city. Albuquerque at night was specific the way desert cities are specific after dark. The heat of the day still radiating from the pavement, the mountains visible as a dark mass against a sky that still held more light than you expected at this hour. She drove with the window down for 3 blocks before she remembered it was November, and the air, even in New Mexico, was cold enough to matter, and she put the window up. The pharmacy on Manal was closed. She hadn't expected otherwise at 2100 on a weeknight. She drove past it once, noted the layout, the neighboring businesses, the parking situation. Then she drove to the residential address in the file and parked 2 houses down. The house had lights on. A car in the driveway, a small sedan, late model, the kind of car a person buys when they are making practical decisions rather than aspirational ones. Elena sat in the rental for a few minutes and thought about how to do this. She had done difficult conversations before conversations in hospital corridors, in family waiting rooms, in the specific charged space of a briefing room when the person across from her didn't want to hear what she was saying. But this was different. This was a civilian at her own front door at 2100, being asked to open up a chapter she had closed and walk back into it. She got out of the car. The woman who opened the door was not quite the woman in the photograph, 2 years older. The specific way outdoor desert air changes a person's face slightly, wearing clothes that said she had been in for the evening and was not expecting company. She looked at Elena with the immediate wariness of a woman alone, at night opening her door to a stranger, which was reasonable and which Elena addressed immediately by holding out the identification documentation. Prentice had prepared and saying, "My name is Carter. I'm not here to cause you any trouble. I'm here about what happened at the forward station 5 years ago, and I need 10 minutes. Nadia Reston's face went through 3 visible changes in 4 seconds. The wariness didn't leave. It just reorganized itself around something else, something deeper and older and more complicated than the simple caution of a stranger at the door. She stepped back and opened the door wider. Elena walked in. The inside of the house was the home of someone who was making a life quietly and carefully clean, organized, a few plants on the windowsill, a textbook on the coffee table with a university library sticker on the spine. Reston was taking classes, making something new. Elena looked at all of that and felt the specific weight of what she was about to ask a person to put down. She said it anyway. She owed Rastan the full truth, so she gave it the documentation, the review board, the 19-day window, Harwick's counterclaim, what Reston's testimony could do and what it would cost her in time and exposure, and the specific pain of going back to something you had worked to get past. Reston sat across from her on the couch and listened without interrupting. When Elena finished, she sat with her hands flat on her knees for a long moment. I thought about coming forward, she said, after I separated. I thought about it a lot. I know, Elena said. I didn't because she stopped. I didn't think it would matter. I thought Harwick was too far up. Too connected. He is connected, Elena said. That's why the window is 19 days and not 6 months. That's why I'm in your living room at 9 o'clock, instead of this going through normal channels. She paused. I'm not going to tell you it's safe. I'm not going to tell you there's no cost. But I'm going to tell you that those 3 men deserve to have someone say what happened to them out loud, in a room where it goes on the record, and I can't make that happen alone. Reston looked at her. You were the one who filed the objection. Yes. Harwick got you discharged. Yes. And you still have the records. Yes. Reston was quiet. She looked at the textbook on the coffee table. She looked at the plants on the windowsill. She looked at the life she had built in the distance from that forward station, and Elena watched her look at it, watched her measure it against something that had apparently never fully resolved itself. The way things that are wrong and unrectified stay present in a person's interior, no matter how much exterior distance accumulates. I need to know one thing, Reston said. Ask. If I do this, if I give my statement, is it going to actually matter? Or is this going to stall again, and the window closes and nothing changes? Elena looked at her. I don't know, she said. I can tell you that the documentation is solid. I can tell you that we have 2 other witnesses already. I can tell you that Prentice is the best JAG officer I've seen in a formal review process. She paused. I can't promise you the outcome. Nobody can. Reston held her gaze. But you're here anyway. I'm here anyway. Another silence. The house settled around them. Outside, a car went past on the street, and its headlights crossed the window and moved on. Reston uncurled her hands from her knees and put them flat on the couch cushions and looked at Elena with an expression that had resolved from something complicated into something simpler and harder. Okay, she said. Let me get my coat. The relief Elena felt was real, and she didn't let it show, because Reston didn't need to see relief. She needed to see steadiness. Elena stood and nodded and turned toward the door, and that was when her phone vibrated in her jacket pocket, the secure phone Rourke's driver had given her, the one that had been silent since she landed. She checked the screen. It was a text from Prentice. 4 words and a name. Harwick knows about Reston. Elena's hand tightened around the phone. She looked at Reston, who was pulling a jacket from a hook by the door and had not seen the message. Then she looked out the front window at the quiet residential street and the parked cars and the specific ordinary nighttime stillness of a neighborhood in a desert city and saw, 2 blocks down, a vehicle she had not noticed when she pulled up, parked without its lights on and sitting slightly wrong in the darkness. The vehicle was a dark SUV, late model, and it was parked with its nose, angled slightly towards the street in the way that people park when they want to be able to leave fast. Elena had driven past it when she arrived, and her brain had logged it without flagging it, the way you absorb a street's contents without actively processing them. Now she processed it. The position was wrong for a resident, too far from any driveway, too precisely oriented. And it had been there when she arrived, which meant whoever was inside had gotten here before her. Which meant Harwick's people had not followed her from the base. They had already known where Reston lived. She turned away from the window before her expression could change in a way Reston might read. Reston was buttoning her jacket, not looking at Elena, doing the small mechanical things people do when they are gathering themselves for something hard. Elena had about 30 seconds to make a decision. "Change of plan," she said, keeping her voice at a conversational register. "We're not taking my car." Reston looked up. She read Elena's face, and whatever she saw there shifted her own expression from determined to alert. "What's wrong?" "Nothing yet." Elena was already moving through the house, not toward the front door, but toward the back. "Is there a rear exit?" "Kitchen. It goes out to the alley." Reston moved without asking a second question, which told to Elena something shameful about her. The pharmacy tech, who had spent time at a forward operating station, had not entirely lost the instincts that environment built. She was ahead of Elena into the kitchen, keys already off a hook near the back door. "My neighbor has a truck. He leaves it in the alley on weeknights." "Does he owe you anything?" "I watered his plants for 3 weeks last summer." "That'll do," Elena said. She texted Prentice as they moved, "Rear exit. Need extraction point 2 blocks north of primary address. How fast can you move?" The response came in 40 seconds, 8 minutes. "Blue Tahoe. Driver is Ortega." 8 minutes was a long time if the people in the SUV just decided to move. It was a short time if they were still sitting on passive surveillance and hadn't yet made contact up the chain. Elena's read of the situation, the parked position, the lights off, the fact that no one had knocked on Reston's door. In the time Elena had been inside, said passive. They were watching, waiting for confirmation, probably reporting in before acting. That was either protocol or hesitation, and either way, it bought her something. The alley was narrow and smelled of dry desert dust and someone's discarded cardboard. The neighbor's truck was where Reston said it would be a 10-year-old Chevy, dark blue, unlocked in the way that people leave vehicles unlocked in alleys. When they live somewhere they consider safe and have for long enough that the habit has calcified. Reston had a spare key. She didn't explain how, and Elena didn't ask. They drove north without headlights for the first half block. Then Elena turned them on and blended into the street traffic, such as it was at this hour on a residential road in Albuquerque. She watched the mirror. The dark SUV did not appear behind them. "Are you going to tell me what that was?" Reston said. "People who don't want you to testify," Elena said. "They're not going to approach you directly, too much exposure. But they needed to know where you were." Reston was quiet for a moment. "So Harwick knows I'm talking to you. He knows you're a name on the list and that someone came to find you. He may not know yet what you decided. He will soon." "Yes," Elena said, which means the timeline just got shorter. Ortega was a compact, quiet man who drove the Blue Tahoe with the efficiency of someone who had done this kind of thing before and found it unremarkable. He took them south on a route that involved 2 unnecessary turns, which Elena recognized as counter-surveillance driving, and which she didn't comment on. Reston sat in the back and held her jacket closed with both hands and looked out the window at the city moving past. Prentice was on the phone when they arrived at the location, a USAF conference room on the edge of Kirtland, small and bare and lit with the kind of fluorescent light that makes everyone look like they've been awake too long, which in this case was accurate. Delgado gave her statement 2 hours ago, Prentice said without preamble. Video deposition on the record. Marks is scheduled for 600 tomorrow from Germany. She looked at Reston. "You're the third." Reston sat down in the chair across from Prentice. She had the looks of someone who has committed to a direction and is now moving through the physical reality of it, which is always harder than the decision itself. "What do you need from me?" "Everything you remember." "In order. With as much specificity as you can manage." Prentice pulled out a recording device and set it on the table. "We're going to be here for a while. Is that okay?" "I've been here for a while already," Reston said. 5 years. "Let's go." Elena moved to the back of the room and let Prentice work. She was good, genuinely good, not in the performative legal manner of someone establishing record, but in the more functional sense of someone who listened with full attention and asked follow-up questions that excavated detail without shaping it. Reston's account came out in the specific way honest accounts do nonlinear at first, circling back to clarify, catching a detail she'd skipped and inserting it, occasionally stopping to sit with something before she could say it. She had been present for all three incidents. She had dispensed the medications. Harwick ordered for patient 2 medications that were contraindicated with the patient's documented allergy, an allergy that was in the chart that Elena had flagged in writing, and that Harwick had explicitly overridden with the notation that the allergy was clinically insignificant in the operational context. Patient 2 had died of anaphylactic complication 6 hours later. Harwick's documentation attributed the death to the underlying injury. Reston had filled the prescription. She had noted the allergy. She had raised it verbally to the administering medic, who had shown her Harwick's written override. She had then done something that had apparently cost her considerable sleep over the following 5 years. She had filled the prescription anyway, because she was 24 years old at a forward station, and a colonel had put his authorization on the order. "I've thought about that every day," she said. "Whether I should have refused." "You were following a superior officer's written order," Prentice said. "The culpability analysis on your action is straightforward. The culpability for the override rests with Harwick." "I know that legally," Reston said. "That's not the same as knowing it the other way." Elena understood exactly what she meant. She didn't say so, because Reston didn't need validation of the feeling. She needed to be heard through it. So Elena stood at the back of the room and listened, and let Prentice do her job. The deposition took 2 hours and 14 minutes. When it was done, Reston leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. In the specific way people look at ceilings when they have emptied something out. She looked younger than she had at the front door. Or possibly older. Elena couldn't quite determine which. "What happens now?" Reston asked. "Now we have 3 witnesses, primary documentation, and a counterclaim that Prentice is going to take apart in the morning," Elena said. "And Harwick? He's going to keep trying to delay," Prentice said. "But the documentation challenge the argument that your records were improperly retained that falls apart when we establish that the charts in question were personal clinical logs, not operational documents. I have the regulatory precedent. It's clean." She paused. "What Harwick has is time and connections. What we have is more. The math is changing in his direction." "Against his direction," Elena corrected. Prentice looked at her. "Yes, that." Elena called Rourke at 130. He answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping, which meant he had been managing the Harwick situation from his end, and it had not been quiet. "Reston gave her statement," Elena said. "Good." His voice was clipped. "We have a problem on this end. Harwick's JAG filed something else." "How did you know?" "Because he's running out of time, and he knows it," she said. "What is it?" "He's alleging that your re-entry documentation is procedurally invalid. Specifically, that the authorization to unseal your service record required a level of sign-off that Prentice's paperwork didn't include." A pause. "It's another delay tactic. But if it lands, your standing in the review process gets questioned, and the documentation you retained goes back to being the work product of a discharged civilian, which is a different evidentiary category." Elena stood in the hallway outside the conference room and looked at the linoleum floor. "What sign-off does he say was missing?" "Deputy secretary level." "He's arguing the re-entry classification required it." "Did it?" A pause that was 1 beat longer than a pause should be. "Technically, the regulation is ambiguous. The authorization I used is standard for the unit's previous re-entries." Harwick's JAG found a memo from 2019 that could be read as requiring the higher sign-off in cases involving unsealed service records. "Could be read," Elena said. Prentice says it's a stretch, but it's a stretch that could take 2 weeks to resolve through normal channels, and we have 19, now 17 days. Elena thought about this. She thought about the 2019 memo, about regulatory ambiguity, about the specific art form of someone who had spent 9 years as a colonel learning, which levers existed inside a bureaucratic system, and how to pull them at the precise moments they would cause the most friction. Harwick was not panicking. He was working, which meant he was worried, and a worried Harwick pulling every lever was more dangerous in the short term than a confident one. "Who can provide the deputy secretary sign-off?" she asked. The deputy secretary herself, or her designated authority. "Can Rourke get there?" "He's working on it." But the deputy secretary's office is managing 2 active international situations right now and getting a same-day authorization on a personnel re-entry classifications. "It's not just a personnel re-entry classification," Elena said. "Tell her office it's connected to an active DoD misconduct review with a 17-day evidentiary window and 3 witness statements already on record. Tell them a colonel is using procedural challenges to run the clock on 3 soldiers' deaths." She paused. "Tell them that." Those words, specifically. A silence. "That's direct. It's also accurate," she said. "And I'm tired of watching accuracy get managed into something softer." She heard Rourke breathe once. "I'll make the call," he said. She slept 3 hours on a cot in the duty room and woke at 500 to a message from Prentice. Mark's deposition complete. Strong. He was in the room for patient 3. Saw Harwick's notation on the chart. Elena sat up and read the message again. Mark's had been in the room. That was different from being adjacent, from hearing afterward, from being the person who dispensed the medication. Marks was an eyewitness to Harwick's direct clinical decision on the 3rd case, and he had given that account on the record at 600 Germany time while Elena was sleeping on a cot in New Mexico. She dressed, went to find coffee, and found, instead, that Prentice was already in the conference room with her laptop and 2 empty cups and the specific wide-awake focus of someone who had not slept at all. "The documentation challenge," Elena said. "Filing a response this morning. I spent the night on it." Prentice looked up. "The 2019 memo Harwick's JAGs cited, I found the drafting record. It was written specifically to address classified intelligence re-entries, not medical personnel. Harwick's JAG is applying it out of context." She turned the laptop to face Elena. "Here's my response. Read the 3rd paragraph." Elena read it. The 3rd paragraph was 14 lines, and it was precise in the way that good legal argument is precise, not ornate, not aggressive, just the specific language of someone who has found the exact distinction that matters, and stated it without extras. "This works," she said. "It works if we can get it in front of the review board before Harwick's team files a response to my response, and we end up in a procedural loop." Prentice pulled the laptop back. "Which is why I need the deputy secretary authorization by noon. Rourke's working it, I know. I've been on the phone with his office twice since 300. She looked at Elena with the expression of someone who is calibrating how much to say. His office is getting pushback, not from the deputy secretary, directly from someone in the chain between Rourke and her office, someone who's slowing the request down. Elena set her coffee cup on the table. "Harwick. Harwick's people," Prentice said. "He's got a contact in the deputy secretary's scheduling office." The request got logged and then sat. Rourke went around it by calling the deputy secretary's chief of staff directly at 430. She paused. "The chief of staff is a woman named Sandra Vate. She's reviewing the case summary right now." "How long?" "We don't know. Could be an hour. Could be 4. Elena thought about 17 days. She thought about Harwick sitting in his comfortable administrative posting in Virginia, the levers he had spent 9 years identifying. And she thought about the 3 men who had died at a forward station in a country that was hot and flat. And she thought at Frau Reston's face when she said, "I've thought about that every day." She thought about Hartwell Regional. about Marlene Briggs's office and the voluntary reassignment and the specific patients she had maintained for 11 months in a department that had decided what she was before it knew anything about her. She had maintained that patience because she was good at the long game, because she understood that the moment to act was not always the first available moment, because she had learned in a forward station at 30 years old, in the worst possible classroom, that timing was clinical. This was the moment. "I need a phone," she said. "A line that can reach Vate's office directly." Prentice looked at her. "You're going to call the Deputy Secretary's Chief of Staff." "I'm going to tell her what happened to 3 soldiers," Elena said. In plain language, not in legal language, not in procedural language. What actually happened. She paused. Someone should. Prentice was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she slid her secure phone across the table. "The number is in the contacts under Vate S." The call lasted 11 minutes. Elena told it the way she had learned to tell it, in order, with specifics, without softening the clinical facts into something more palatable. Patient 1. Patient 2, the allergy, the override, the death. Patient 3, the objection filed 22 hours before, the notation dismissed in 2 sentences, the death. The discharge orders 17 hours later. Vate listened without interrupting. At the end, she asked 2 questions, the case number of the DOD review, which Elena provided, and the name of the lead JEG officer, which she also provided. Then she said she would call Rourke's office within the hour. She called back in 34 minutes. The Deputy Secretary authorization came through at 917. Prentice had the response to Harwick's documentation challenge, Dactman, filed with the review board by 1045. The board's chair sent an acknowledgement at 1130 that the challenge had been reviewed and rejected. Harwick's documentation counterclaim was dismissed. Elena received the notification on the secure phone while she was sitting in a vehicle outside Kirtland's main gate, waiting for Ortega to clear the exit process. She read it once and put the phone in her jacket pocket and looked out the window at a New Mexico morning, cold, clear, the Sandia Mountains sharp-edged against a blue sky that had nothing complicated about it. Reston was being transported separately, under a security arrangement that Prentice had organized through channels that kept her name and address off any accessible log for the duration of the process. She would give a second formal statement in Washington within the week. Marx's deposition was already in the evidentiary record. Delgado's was sealed pending the board's formal opening of the expanded review. Harwick still had 16 days. He still had contacts. He was not finished, and Elena knew that, and she was not operating under the assumption that this dismissed challenge meant the war was over. It meant the war had shifted ground. She was back at FOB Kessler by 1400. Ferraro was sitting up in the ICU bed when she looked in, not fully upright, propped, with the careful posture of someone whose core had recently been opened and closed. But his eyes were tracking, and his color was human again. Callahan was with him. He looked at Elena when she appeared in the doorway and said nothing for a moment. "Then they told me what you found." "Voss found it," Elena said. "In the OR. That's not what they told me." She looked at him, 29 years old, alive, the specific alive that comes after the kind of night he had been through, which was not the easy alive of someone who hadn't been close to the edge, but the heavier, more deliberate alive of someone who had been on the other side of it and come back. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone went into my abdomen twice in 12 hours. He paused. "Better than I felt yesterday." Another pause. "Thank you." Elena nodded. She moved away from the door before she had to say anything else. Voss found her at the supply station 20 minutes later. He was carrying a printed document. She recognized the journal header before he was close enough to read the title. Her paper, the full version. "I read it this morning," he said. Fast reader. I read fast when something is relevant. He held it in both hands. "The lactate indicator, the way you describe the competing cascade suppression." I've seen this presentation twice in the last 18 months and assessed it as standard post-septic progression both times. He looked at her. Both patients survived, but not because of anything I specifically identified. She looked at him. He was telling her something that was uncomfortable. To tell that her Frankfurt had retroactively explained 2 cases he had managed correctly, but for the wrong reasons, that there had been 2 other Ferraros who had gotten lucky. He was telling her because he was honest and because he had read the paper and it had done something to his understanding of his own case history that he couldn't now unread. Write them up, she said, both cases, as a follow-on to the paper. Your data would add to the evidentiary base. He looked slightly surprised. You'd want my name on it. I'd want the data on record, she said. Your name is attached to the data. That's how it works. He stood there for a moment with the paper in his hands. Rourke told me about the unit, he said, the consulting structure. He moves fast. He said you recommended me. I said you'd be an asset. That's different from recommending. She looked at him. It's your call. He didn't answer that directly, which she noted. He said, I'd want to understand the full scope before I decided anything. That's the right answer, she said, and walked on. Rourke's call came at 1720. She was in the briefing room reviewing the case documents when the secure phone vibrated. Harwick's JG filed again, he said. She had expected something. Not this specific shape of it, but something. What now? He's not challenging the documentation or your standing anymore. Rourke's voice was controlled in the specific way that experience teaches a person to be controlled when the news is bad and the situation requires clear thinking faster than emotion. He's gone to the Inspector General's office. He's filed a complaint alleging that you coerced a civilian witness, Reston, into providing a statement under duress, and that the statement should be excluded from the record. Elena set the document she was holding on the table. I was in her living room for 45 minutes. She drove herself to the interview. Prentice took her statement with a full record of voluntary participation. I know. Prentice knows. The IG office knows. Because Prentice sent the procedural record over within the hour. He paused. But Harwick's JAG is not just filing the coercion complaint. They're also alleging that the security response Ortega, the rear exit extraction, constitutes military intimidation of a civilian witness. That Elena Carter, operating under military reentry authority, used that authority to surveil and pressure a civilian. The room was very quiet. Elena looked at the documents on the table. It's backwards, she said. Ortega was there because Harwick's people were already outside her house. I know, they were surveilling her. We moved her because she was in danger. I know, Rourke said again. But Harwick's filing inverts the timeline. His version says, our extraction constitutes intimidation. If the IG takes it seriously enough to open a preliminary inquiry, it freezes the review board's evidentiary process while the inquiry runs. Elena did the arithmetic. An IG preliminary inquiry could run 2 to 4 weeks. The review board's window was now 16 days. He doesn't need it to succeed, she said. He just needs it to be open long enough.
Nice. Yes.
She stood up from the table and walked to the window. The compound was doing its early evening transition lights coming on in the structures, the on flatness of the afternoon flatness giving way to the kind of dark that arrived quickly in winter at altitude. She thought about Richard Harwick in administrative posting in Virginia in an office she had never seen, doing the thing he'd apparently been very good at for 9 years, surviving through friction, through procedural obstruction, through the specific patience of a man who believed that time was always on his side. He had spent 5 years believing that. He had been right for 5 years. The surveillance record, she said. The vehicle outside Reston's house. Is there any way to document it? We're working on that. Ortega noted the plates. Running them now. How long? 2 hours, maybe 3. She looked at the window. And the IG complaint, who received it. What's the name of the officer it went to? Colonel Diane Pruett. She's the assistant IG for personnel misconduct. She's a pause. She's thorough. She's not going to be influenced by Harwick's network, if that's what you're asking. But thorough cuts both ways. She's going to look at everything. Good, Elena said. I want her to look at everything. I want her to look at the plates on that SUV. I want her to look at how Harwick's people knew where Reston lived before we got there. I want her to look at who, in the Deputy Secretary's scheduling office, sat on Rourke's authorization request for 6 hours. Rourke was quiet. The coercion complaint is a gift, Elena said, because it opens the door to a counter-investigation into how Harwick knew to send people to Reston's address. She paused. Someone inside gave him the name. Someone who had access to my list. Another silence. Longer Carter. Rourke's voice had changed. Just slightly. The list you provided the 7 names. Who had access to it after you handed it over? In this building, she said. Prentice. You. Whoever Prentice used to run the location searches. Prentice used 2 research assistants from the JAG support pool. Then one of them has a connection to Harwick, Elena said. Or someone accessed the file through a channel that wasn't supposed to have it. She turned away from the window. That's your leak. And if you can document the leak, you can document that Harwick's team was running active interference with a DOD investigation. That's not a delay tactic anymore. That's obstruction. The silence on the line was the specific silence of a calculation being completed. I need to make some calls, Rourke said. Make them, Elena said. She set the phone on the table and stood in the briefing room in the quiet of a military installation at dusk. And she thought about Richard Harwick making his own calls somewhere in Virginia, pulling the last levers he had. And she thought about the specific difference between a man who uses systems to stay hidden and a man who has finally been pulled into the light far enough that the systems he's using are the things that illuminate him. He had filed an IG complaint. He had put his interference on record. He had, in trying to freeze the process, handed them the evidence of the interference itself. She picked up the secure phone and called Prentice. The IG complaint, she said when Prentice answered. Don't contest it. Welcome it. File a cross-complaint immediately alleging that Harwick's network conducted unauthorized surveillance of a civilian witness using information that could only have been obtained through improper access to a protected DOD investigation file. Prentice was quiet for 2 seconds. That reframes the entire IG inquiry. Yes, if we can document the leak. Rourke is working the leak now. Elena looked at the documents on the table. How fast can you file? Tonight, Prentice said. Give me 3 hours. You have 2, Elena said. He's already been ahead of us once today. I don't want him ahead of us twice. The line was quiet for a moment, and then Prentice said something Elena did not expect, not the legal strategy, not the timeline confirmation, but something that came from a different place. You've been doing this a long time. Elena looked at the window, at the dark outside it. Longer than I wanted to, she said. She ended the call and sat down at the table and pulled the case documents back in front of her. The cross-complaint, the leak investigation, the plates on the SUV, the scheduling office contact who had delayed Rourke's authorization. Each piece of it was a thread, and Harwick had spent 5 years maintaining the fiction that the threads didn't connect, that they were separate incidents, separate decisions, the normal friction of a large bureaucratic system. She had 14 pages of clinical charts that said otherwise. She had 3 witnesses. She had Prentice filing in 2 hours. She had Rourke pulling a thread that led directly into Harwick's network. And she had something else, something she hadn't told Rourke yet, because she had needed to be certain before she said it. She pulled out the copy of the original document, her own, the one from the secure retrieval, and turned to the third patient's chart, to Harwick's 2-sentence notation dismissing her objection. She had read that notation 100 times in 5 years, had it memorized, had it in the part of her memory that stored things which should not be forgotten. She read it again now and saw what she had noticed 2 days ago and had not yet fully processed a discrepancy in the timestamp. The notation was dated 17 hours before the patient died. But the chart's own audit trail, embedded in the document's metadata, showed the notation had been modified 14 hours after the patient's death. Harwick had backdated his dismissal of her objection. He hadn't just overridden her. He had rewritten the timeline to make it appear that his decision predated the outcome, that he had exercised clinical judgment rather than ignored a warning. He had altered a dead soldier's medical chart. That was not a personnel matter. That was not a scope of practice dispute. That was a federal crime. She picked up the phone. She called Prentice first, because Prentice was the one who needed to know before anyone else acted. The timestamp on Harwick's notation, Elena said. Third patient's chart. The visible date says he made the notation 17 hours before the patient died. But the document's metadata shows a modification 14 hours after. The line was quiet for 4 full seconds. In legal terms, 4 seconds of Prentice silence was the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. "You have the original file," Prentice said. "The one from secure retrieval." "In my hand. The metadata is embedded in the document itself, not in an external log. It's in the document's own audit trail. The format is a DoD clinical records template from that year. They embedded modification timestamps in the file structure to prevent exactly this kind of alteration." Elena looked at the page. Harwick didn't know that, or he forgot, or he thought no one would ever pull the original. She paused. Or he thought the person who had the original would never be in a position to use it. "That's chart tampering," Prentice said. "In a military medical context, on a deceased service member's record, that is a federal criminal offense. It is not a personnel matter. It is not a misconduct finding. It is not a review board outcome." Her voice had the quality of someone who is keeping themselves deliberately, even because the alternative is not useful. "That is a criminal referral to the DoD Inspector General and potentially to the Department of Justice." "I know," Elena said. "Can you document it tonight?" "I can document it in the next 2 hours," Prentice said. "I need a digital copy of the file with the metadata intact. Do not print it. Do not screenshot it. Do not do anything that creates a derivative version. Send me the original through the secure transfer protocol. Rourke's office will have the credentials." "Done," Elena said. And Prentice, "Yes, this doesn't change the cross-complaint. File both." "Absolutely both," Prentice said, and ended the call. Elena transferred the file, then sat in the briefing room for 20 minutes doing nothing, which was unusual for her, and which she allowed herself because the next several hours were going to require a particular kind of steadiness, and she had learned in enough high-stakes situations to know it as fact rather than theory. You did not get that steadiness from motion. You got it from the deliberate act of sitting still and letting the noise settle. She thought about Richard Harwick and the metadata and the specific calculus of what he had done, not in anger, not in panic, but in the quiet aftermath of a patient's death, sitting with the chart and a timestamp, and the chart and a timestamp, and the cold decision to make the record say something other than what had happened. That was not a man who had made a terrible mistake under pressure. That was a man who had made a terrible mistake and then chosen, with full deliberation, to protect himself instead of the truth. She had spent 5 years being angry about the first thing. The second thing was worse, and she felt the shift in her understanding of it, the way you feel a weight redistribute, not lighter, but differently carried. Rourke knocked on the door at 2100 and came in and sat across from her with the look of a man who has been on the phone for 4 hours and has things to report. "The plates on the SUV outside Reston's house," he said. "Registered to a private security firm in Arlington, Virginia. The firm has one client on record for the past 3 years." He set a single printed page on the table. "Harwick uses them for what his financial disclosure calls executive personal security. He's been paying them out of a personal account, not DoD funds, his own money. He hired private security to surveil a civilian witness, Elena said, before any legal action was filed against her, before she was formally identified as a witness in any proceeding. Rourke's voice was flat, which means he had access to the witness list before it was filed with the review board, which means the leak in the JAG support pool is confirmed as a conduit, and which also means he used private funds to conduct what amounts to witness intimidation, outside any official process. Elena looked at the page. That's 3 separate criminal exposure points. The chart tampering, the witness surveillance, and the improper access to a protected investigation file, Rourke said. Prentice is filing the criminal referral to the Dodd IG simultaneously with the cross-complaint. She reached Colonel Pruitt at home 30 minutes ago and briefed her verbally. He paused. Pruitt asked for the full file package by 600. She'll have it. She also asked, Rourke said, carefully, whether the individual who identified the metadata discrepancy would be available to give a direct statement to the IG's office. Yes, Elena said, whenever they need. He nodded. Then he looked at her with the expression he had been refining over the past 2 days, the one that was not quite admiration and not quite something else, but sat in the specific territory between recognizing a person and revising your understanding of how much space they actually occupy. You've been thinking about the metadata since you first saw the chart, he said. Since the secure retrieval. I wasn't certain until I checked the template format. She looked at the table. 5 years ago, I didn't have access to the original. I had copies of copies. The metadata doesn't survive that. She paused. He didn't know I had requested the original from secure storage. He thought if there was documentation, it would be derivative. He underestimated what you kept, Rourke said. People usually do, Elena said, and did not mean it bitterly, just accurately. Colonel Richard Harwick was placed on administrative hold at 743 the following morning, Washington time. Elena was in Kessler's common area with coffee when Prentice called to confirm it. The IG's office had reviewed the criminal referral overnight and moved faster than Prentice had predicted faster. She suspected, because Colonel Pruitt was the kind of thorough that cuts both ways, as Rourke had said, and what it cut in this direction was decisively. The administrative hold meant Harwick could not access DoD systems, could not communicate with personnel under investigation, and could not file further legal challenges through military channels while the criminal inquiry was active. His JAG could continue working through civilian legal frameworks, but the procedural levers inside the military system, the ones he had been pulling for 5 years, were frozen. The review board has been notified, Prentice said. The evidentiary window remains open. We have 13 days, which is now more than enough. And the IG complaint he filed against me, suspended pending the outcome of the criminal inquiry into his conduct. A pause. It's not dismissed yet. But the investigative priority has inverted. He filed a complaint alleging, you pressured a witness. The IG is now investigating him for surveilling that same witness with private security before she was even formally identified. Another pause. Colonel Pruitt's words when I spoke to her at 600 were, the complaint recontextualizes itself in light of the new evidence, which is the most restrained way I have ever heard someone describe a filing that has turned completely around. Elena set down the coffee cup. What's Harwick's status? He's retained civilian counsel. They're preparing a response, but they're working without the military procedural tools he's had until now, and civilian litigation against a DoD criminal referral with this documentation is... Prentice paused. It's a long fight, and he's going to lose it. How long? 6 months to a formal finding, probably. Another 3 to sentencing, if the criminal charges proceed. There'll be a discharge process running parallel. A pause. He's not going to be a colonel in 6 months. He's probably not going to be a free man in 12. Asna sat with that, not with satisfaction. Exactly, satisfaction felt too clean for what this was. It felt more like the specific sensation of a pressure that has been present so long, You stopped conscious hostility, registering it, finally releasing, all at once, in a way that was almost disorienting in its completeness. She thought about 3 soldiers. She thought about their names, which she still knew, which she had always known, which she had written in a notebook in a forward station and memorized because he had understood at 29 that if she didn't hold their names, no one else would. She said their names quietly to herself, alone in the common room, and that was the closest thing to a memorial she had ever been able to give them. And it was not enough, and it was what there was. The Hartwell peer review finding came through 11 days later. Elena was at Kessler. She had not gone back to Denver in the interim, had been working the unit's orientation process while the legal machinery moved at its own pace when OC's office sent the formal document through Prentice's secure channel. She read it in the briefing room with Rourke present, not because she needed him there, but because he had asked to be. And she had found over the past 2 weeks that his presence in rooms where things concluded was less about authority and more about the specific way he paid attention to outcomes. The peer review panel had consisted of 3 physicians and 2 senior nursing administrators from outside Hartwell's system, assembled per the hospital's standard protocol for cross-departmental review. They had reviewed the Bay 3 incident in full, the patient presentation, the nursing assessment, the attending physician's initial response, the sequence and timing of the intervention, the outcome. Their finding was unambiguous. The nursing intervention had been clinically appropriate. The diagnosis of tension pneumothorax had been correct, had been made before imaging was available, and before the attending had acted, and had been the determining factor in the patient's survival. The panel noted that the attending physician's initial delay in responding to the nursing assessment represented a deviation from best practice in time-critical emergency presentation. The panel further noted that the charge nurse's subsequent suggestion of voluntary reassignment to her involved was inconsistent with Hartwell's stated policies regarding staff who demonstrated some exceptional clinical judgment. Dr. Philip Sorrow's formal complaint was found to be without clinical basis and was dismissed with notation in the permanent record. Charge nurse Marlene Briggs was referred to Hartwell's Human Resources Administration for a review of her conduct regarding the reassignment suggestion and the handling of the post-incident period. Elena folded the document along its crease and held it in both hands for a moment. Rourke did not say anything. He understood. She had learned when silence was the appropriate response to something. She thought about Bay 3, about Marcus Webb's pulse ox climbing 87, 89, 91, and the specific relief of watching a number move in the right direction when you have committed everything you have to the bet that it will. She thought about the 14-gauge angiocath and the sound of pressurized air and the moment the room went quiet. She thought about all the moments before that one. The restocked supply carts, the call lights that had been ringing for 6 minutes. Mr. Aldridge's blood pressure flagged and followed up. The cardiac arrest 3 weeks before Bay 3, the woman who had gone into VFib between the waiting room and the bed, whose survival had been documented in the chart under Sarah's name. None of that had been invisible. It had all been witnessed by patients, by their bodies, by the irreducible fact of outcomes. The people who had refused to see it were the only ones who had been blind, and their blindness was their own problem, not a property of the things they had failed to look at. She set the document on the table. "I want a copy sent to doctor." "OC with a cover note," she said. "The note should say that I appreciate the thoroughness of the review process and that I have no further action to request at this time." Rourke looked at her. "That's generous. It's accurate," she said. "OC ran the review properly. That's what I asked for." She paused. Sorrow and Marlene made their choices. The record reflects them now. That's sufficient. Most people in your position would want more than sufficient. Most people in my position haven't been thinking about this for 11 months, she said. I've had time to figure out what I actually want, and it's not retribution. It's the record. She looked at him. The record is right now. That's what I wanted. She called Sandra Okafor that evening. Not Callum Bates, not anyone else from Hartwell Okafor, who had been new enough to still look uncertain, who had made brief eye contact across the room in a way that felt like a question, who had taken the chart from Elena's hands on the day the Black Hawk landed with the expressions of someone trying very hard to understand something they didn't yet have the context for. Okafor picked up on the third ring. There was a moment of silence when Elena identified herself, the specific silence of genuine surprise. And then I heard about the peer review. Word travels, Elena said. It traveled fast, Okafor said. Sorrow's been, I don't know how to describe it. He's not saying much. Neither is Marlene. A pause. The rest of us are saying a lot. I can imagine. I wanted to when you left. I wanted to say something, and I didn't. Okafor's voice was careful in the way of someone choosing words honestly rather than strategically. I'd seen you working, I knew what you were. I just didn't. I wasn't. You were new, Elena said, and the department had a clear social structure. I understand. That's a kind way to put it. It's a true way, Elena said. I'm not calling to make you feel bad about it. I'm calling because you're going to be in that for a while. And the patient in Bayfor Aldridge, I flagged in Bayfor Aldridge. I flagged his pressure twice before I left, and I want to know he got his follow-up. A beat. Then Okafor laughed a short, surprised sound, the kind that comes when a person has braced for something and received something completely different instead. He was discharged 4 days ago, she said. GI found a small bleed, treated it. He's fine. Good, Elena said. Is there anything else you want to tell me? Okafor asked. About, I don't know, how to be in a department like this one. Elena thought about the question. She thought about 11 months and what they had taught her, and she thought about what she would have wanted someone to say to her on her first week at Hartwell, or her first week at the forward station, or at any of the other places where she had walked in and been assessed and found lacking before she had done a single thing. Trust what you see, she said, not what the room decides to see. Not what the hierarchy tells you to see. What you actually see with your own clinical eyes when you walk in and put your hands on a patient. She paused. The hierarchy exists for good reasons. Work within it whenever you can. But if you walk into a bay and you see something that the room is missing and the patient is running out of time, don't wait for permission. What if I'm wrong? Okafor said. You might be, Elena said. Being wrong is survivable. Being silent when you're right isn't always. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Okafor said, I'm going to be a better nurse because you were here. Elena sat with that. It was a simple sentence, and it landed somewhere real, somewhere that the peer review finding and the IG referral and the administrative hold on Harwick had not quite reached a quieter place, more interior, where the question of whether any of this had mattered lived not in legal documents, but in the ordinary, unremarkable continuation of a department that would keep seeing patients tomorrow and the day after, and in the nurses who would be in it, working in the space that the past 11 months had changed. Take care of yourself, Elena said, and get some sleep. The night shift is long. She ended the call. Dominic Ferraro was discharged from Kessler's medical facility on a Thursday morning, walking on his own, slowly, carefully, with the deliberate quality of someone whose core had been through a significant event and was reminding him of that fact with every step. But walking. His team was there. Elena watched from the doorway of the medical bay as they surrounded him in the specific way that groups of people surround someone they almost lost, not with ceremony, just with proximity, the unconscious closing of a formation around the person who had been outside it. The sergeant first class, the one who had come to the common room, who had said thank you to the room, without turning around, came to find her before the transport left. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and did not say the big things which she appreciated. He's going to spend a month complaining about the scar, he said. That's a good sign, she said. Yeah. He looked at Ferraro across the compound. He asked me who called it. I told him the whole story. He looked back at her. He wanted me to tell you that he plans to be insufferable about surviving, and he blames you for that. Professionally, Elena looked at Ferraro, who was moving toward the transport vehicle with his team orbiting him, and she thought that she could not have asked for a better outcome in any clinical sense, and that the human sense was, as it always was, more complicated and more worth having. Tell him to listen to his doctors, she said, and actually do his physical therapy. People skip it and they regret it. I'll tell him, the sergeant said. He nodded once, turned to go, stopped. I've been in this unit for 11 years. I've seen some things. He looked at her. What you did, walking in here in hospital scrubs with no notice, no brief, no backup, and turning that case around, I've seen a lot of people try to be that person. You just were. He left before she could respond, which was probably wise because she did not have a clean response to it. She stood in the doorway and watched the transport move through the compound gate and felt the specific weight of being seen clearly by someone who had been paying close attention and the specific discomfort of not knowing what to do with that weight except carry it. She signed the full unit documentation on a Friday afternoon in Rourke's office, with Prentice present as the JAGI witness. The rank designation on the contract was the same one that had been on the initial paperwork reinstated, backdated to preserve the service record continuity that her discharge had interrupted. It came with a security clearance review that had taken the better part of 2 weeks and had apparently generated paperwork that Prentice described as substantial, which, in Prentice's language, meant considerable. Rourke slid a second document across the desk after she signed the first. She looked at it. Your service record, he said. The sealed portions, unsealed, as promised. She opened it. She had known approximately what it would contain: the formal objection, the discharge process, the clinical documentation from the forward station, but seeing it unsealed, with the classification markings removed, and the full narrative of those events present and accessible and on official record, was different from knowing it abstractly. It was the difference between knowing a door is unlocked and actually opening it. The 3 soldiers' names were in the record. Their cases were documented. Her objection was documented. The sequence of Harwick's decisions and her response to them, and the discharge that followed all of it, was there, not buried, not redacted, not managed into something that protected the institution at the cost of the truth. She closed the folder. One more thing, Rourke said. He opened his desk drawer and set a single item on the desk. A hospital ID badge, Hartwell Regional, her photograph, the name Carter in the standard font. She looked at it. Where did you get this? You left it, he said. You handed your patient's chart to Okafor. Your badge was still clipped to your scrubs when you got on the helicopter. He paused. I've been keeping it. She picked it up. She looked at her own photograph, the slightly overexposed flash, the standard blue lanyard, the name of a hospital that had spent 11 months deciding she was less than she was. She thought about everything the badge represented, everything it didn't, and about the distance between those two things, and about what she had done in the space of that distance. She set it on Rourke's desk. Keep it, she said. I don't need it anymore. The Harwick case concluded formally 7 months later, though Elena received the news in a different country and in the middle of a different crisis, which was the nature of the unit's work. The world kept producing situations that required exactly the kind of person she was, and she kept being in them. The formal finding was delivered to her via secure message while she was in a field medical station that bore a functional resemblance to the one where this had all started, which was the kind of coincidence that life produces with enough frequency that it stops being surprising and starts being something closer to instructive. Harwick was found guilty on 3 counts: falsification of a military medical record, improper use of private resources to conduct surveillance of a protected witness in an active DoD investigation, and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was dishonorably discharged. The sentencing included 18 months in a federal facility, which was less than some people thought was adequate, and more than he had spent 5 years believing he would ever face. The three soldiers' cases were formally re-examined by a military medical review board. Their deaths were reclassified from operational casualties to preventable deaths resulting from command negligence. Their families received formal notification and, where applicable, corrected benefit determinations. The notifications did not bring anyone back. They were not intended to. They were intended to make the record true, which was the least that truth could do for the dead, and also, Elena had come to understand, not a small thing. Nadia Reston was recognized by the IG's office for her cooperation with the investigation. She finished her degree. The textbook on the coffee table had been for a pharmacology program and accepted a position at a hospital in Santa Fe. She sent Unsa a message through Prentice's office when she started, 2 sentences. First day. Thought you should know. Elena sent back one. Good. Master Sergeant Delgado was promoted within the year. CW3 Marks requested a transfer back stateside and received it. Callahan at Kessler took on a senior training role for the unit's medical support function. Voss co-authored a follow-on paper with Elena that added 4 new cases to the blast pattern sepsis literature, including Ferraro's, which Ferraro found out about and was, by all reports, insufferably proud of, as predicted. Callum Bates at Hartwell Regional became, over the following year, the kind of resident who listened to nurses in emergency situations, which was not a small thing either. She did not think about Hartwell Regional often. When she did, it was not with bitterness, which occasionally surprised her and then did not. Bitterness required a belief that what had happened to her was exceptional, that the specific brand of dismissal she had experienced was a unique injustice visited specifically on her. It wasn't. She knew that. She had seen it at the forward station and at Hartwell, and in every institutional structure she had ever inhabited the economy of visibility, the way hierarchies distribute recognition, according to their own internal logic, rather than according to merit, the specific weight that invisible work on the people did the invisible work, while the credit moved in other directions. What she thought about, when she thought about Hartwell, was the patient in Bay 3, the needle, the sound of air, the pulse ox climbing. She thought about what it meant that the right call had been available to make, that the clinical knowledge was there, the instinct was there, the willingness was there, and that the only thing standing between a 26-year-old man's survival and his death had been a single person willing to say needle, now in a room that wasn't ready to hear it. She thought about all the rooms in the world that weren't ready to hear it. About all the people with the knowledge and the instinct and the willingness who were standing in those rooms right now, absorbing the specific patient weight of being dismissed, deciding whether to stay quiet or to speak. She thought about what it costs to speak. She had paid that cost and knew its exact weight. She thought about what it costs not to. That arithmetic was always the same in the end. In every room with every patient, under every set of conditions that made it easier to stay in your lane and let the hierarchy manage the outcome. The arithmetic was always the same, and the answer was always the same. And the only variable was whether you had the specific kind of courage that did not require you to be unafraid, just required you to act anyway with whatever you had, in whatever scrubs you happened to be wearing, in whatever parking lot the helicopter chose to land in. She had been that person for 11 months in a department that couldn't see her. She had been that person for 5 years before that, at a forward station in a country that was hot and flat, holding copies of documents that she had made because she understood that the truth sometimes needed a custodian willing to keep it in an inconvenient place until the world was ready to receive it. She was still that person. She would always be that person. Not because it had been rewarded, the reward had come late and imperfect, and in forms she hadn't anticipated, but because there was no version of herself that wasn't. Some people find that out about themselves in comfortable circumstances, with adequate time and appropriate support structures. Some people find it out in an emergency bay with a needle in their hand and a room full of people waiting to be wrong about them. Either way, you find it out. Elena Carter found it out in a hospital in Denver on a gray Tuesday morning, and then spent the next several months making sure it went on the record, and then got back to work because the work was the thing. And it always had been, and wherever the next room was, she was already on her way to it.